Probably the most iconic, the most popular, and the most recognizable tractor throughout the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s was the famous Fordson Major. With its distinctive blue colour and its red wheels, it stood out wherever it went. Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome back to the Agromotive Farm Machinery YouTube channel. Tonight I'm going to have a chat about the famous, iconic, legendary Fordson Major that was built between the years 1945 and 1964 and was popular all over the world. So before we start with the Major itself, we'll go back to the tractor that it replaced. So the Fordson Model N. The Fordson Model N was probably one of the most important tractors certainly throughout the early 1940s during the war, because it was one of the only tractors, certainly in Europe, in the UK and Europe and throughout Ireland, that was still in mass production as the war was going on. The Model N began its production in 1929 to 1932 in Cork, actually, in Ireland. So it had a brief 3-year stint down in Cork before moving to the new plant in Dagenham in the UK, where the Model N was built right up until 1945. So the Model N was probably the last of the old vintage looking tractors. It was big, it was heavy, there was no real bonnet on it, it was just a big tank, it was a big radiator out the front. I think the tank and the radiator were nearly all the one unit, big block on it, all one big unit, a big heavy tractor. You sat out the back of it, then you're nearly hanging off the back of the tractor. You got onto it from behind, you got onto the seat from behind. It was getting outdated, certainly coming towards the middle of the 1940s, and especially when with the imminent arrival of the little grey Fergie, the T20 was on the way. That was much smaller, had a vastly more sophisticated hydraulic system. It actually had a hydraulic system that the Model N had little or no hydraulic system, had no 3-point linkage. It was just a draft tractor. So the writing was on the wall for the Model N coming towards the middle of the 1940s. Yeah, the war was over, and I suppose still a lot of material was in short supply. Labour was in short supply. A lot of men that were killed during the war. And when you look at the UK especially, the women played a huge part through the war effort, the land army, as they were called, throughout the Second World War, with the Model N, and then when it ended, and the famous E27N, as it was called, that replaced it, which was the original Major, and some christened it the High Major. That was its nickname, the High Major. The reason for the High Major I'll get into later on, but that was the first of the Major. Now, this particular tractor was more of a stopgap than the start of a new line. So it's not that it was rushed together, they wanted to modernize the old N, so the old Model N had to go. The E27N was introduced. This was the first of the Majors, and it ran from 1945 right up until 1952. Yeah, so the E27N was still a huge improvement on the Model N. So it had a vastly superior transmission system. It had a sleeker look about it. It had retained the old petrol engine, but it had a new option of a factory fit diesel engine from the factory. So it was a Perkins diesel engine, 4-cylinder diesel engine, and it was available from 1948. So yeah, it was also equipped with a lot of things that the Model N wasn't equipped with. It had a diff lock, it had a diff, it had a PTO, and it had an optional hydraulic lift. So yeah, it was short-lived. It was a short-lived model. So into the early 50s, then 1953 saw the introduction of what was deemed the new Major, so the E1A. This was to become the Major that I suppose we all became more familiar with as the 50s and 60s went on. So the new Major, it was launched in 1951. It made much aplomb in Southend-on-Sea, so the world's press anyone that was involved in agriculture were invited to the launch of this new machine, and it was a huge success from day one. So the introduction obviously was delayed due to the shortages after the war, but it was introduced with new Ford engines. The 4D was available in a diesel, a petrol or a petrol kerosene engine. The 6-speed modified transmission of the E27N was retained. So the original, the transmission from the E27N was retained, but it was slightly modified. But the E1A New Major was a hugely popular tractor at the time. Now, it was still a bigger tractor than the TE20, but it did have the 3-point linkage, it had PTO, it had a form of draft control as well. And I suppose when you looked at the Ferguson system at the time, Ferguson wanted you to buy into a system. So if you bought the Ferguson TE20, they wanted you to buy the plough and everything to go along with it. And the tractor the Ferguson was built around the implements as well. So they wanted to sell a suite of things, whereas the Fordson Major sort of relied on what it had in its own arsenal, what it could do by itself. It was probably better for traction in terms of its weight. The wheels were bigger, tires and that would have been bigger on it. It would have a better stance in it. It was actually a better machine on the likes of hills and stuff like that. It was safer. And in 1958, then they did up the power of it. So you had the Power Major. The Power Major was launched in 1958, and again, power went up to 52 horsepower. You had improved transmission, and you had live drive hydraulics and live PTO. And at this time as well, around the launch, the same year as the launch of the Power Major, we saw the introduction of the Fordson Dexter. Now, the Fordson Dexter was very, very similar to the Major, except it was just smaller. It had a 3-cylinder engine, and it was a direct rival for the Ferguson T20 and the later Ferguson 35s. Yeah, the Ferguson 35. So it would have been that size of a tractor, where the T20 was very, very popular. It was lightweight, it was nimble around yards, and that it was very easy to maneuver. The Dexter would have been introduced to go head to head within that market, where the bigger Major, I suppose, was out on its own, doing its own thing. It was a big ploughing tractor. It was a good heavy draft tractor. So then, you had the Power Major. It was very, very popular. It outsold the Nuffield Universal, and it went head to head with the T20 as well. And between the Major and the Dexter, I do believe that they outsold the T20 for a certain period of time. Now, there was various, when you look at the Major down through the years, there was various modifications of them available as well. When you had the county crawler, you had the roadless half-track version, you had a 4-wheel drive system then from, I think it was Salenia in Italy. You had industrial models then that were produced for railway application and stuff like that. And then you had, it was the Doe, I think, as well. So you had a lot of variations of them, where Ferguson, suppose, weren't as adaptable to a lot of the heavier industrial kind of stuff that it suited the Major and it suited the size of the tractor at the time. It's interesting to note, just as a side note from all of that, the amount of Fordsons that were exported to the Soviet Union. There was hundreds of thousands of Fordsons exported to the Soviet Union between 1920, 1930, before the war, and then the tractor factories over there literally took them and they copied them. So they made copies of the Fordsons, especially the Model F, I think, before the Model F and Model N, in Stalingrad and Leningrad. So they're still working out there. I've seen videos of them still working these knockoff copies of the Fordson tractors that are still driving in the Soviet Union, still doing a lot of work. 1960 then saw the launch of the next phase, I suppose, in the development of the E1A, and that was the Super Major. So the Super Major again had the 52 horsepower engine, live drive, draft and position control on the hydraulics. So for ploughing and that, you had great control over the hydraulics and depth control. 3-point linkage was standard now, so it wasn't an optional extra. 3-point linkage was standard. You had the diff lock then, so you had the option to lock the diff, which is obviously very important. The headlights moved into the front grille. There was a couple of other cosmetic little small changes, nothing major, but that was I suppose 1960. That was the new Super Major, just a development on from the Major itself, and then into 1963, the last generation of them then was the introduction of the new performance Super Major, it was called. So horsepower then was up to 56 horsepower. You had different wheels then, so the wheels were now a white colour. The colour scheme had changed, so they had gone from, there's a different shade of blue, and the wheels were now a sort of a grey white colour. So that was leaning towards the Ford tractors then from America, and for what was to follow after the Majors had finished. So they looked more like, say, the next generation, the 1000 series model, and the Fords that were being built in the US at the time. So yeah, the performance, the new performance Super Major, 46 horsepower engine, pressed steel wheels, hand throttle was up at the steering wheel, so that's a good way of knowing the difference. Hand throttle was at the steering wheel. I think it had had better lights then as well, and it had more improved instrument panel, a few gauges and dials, temperature gauges and amp gauges and stuff like that. They were improved as well. So that was it. That ran up until 1964 when it was the end of the production for the Major. Coincidentally, 1964 saw the introduction of the 100 series Massey Fergusons. So that again was a huge leap. So when they were introduced, it probably pretty much would have wiped any sales of Fordson Majors. It was time to refresh. So in 1964, the Fordson name was obviously dropped. We went to the Ford. Production ceased at Dagenham, and the new line of tractors was now being built in Basildon. And that was the replacement of the Major, was the 1000 series from 1964 onwards. And 1964 also saw the release of the 100 series, the Massey Fergusons as well. So yeah, that's it. That's pretty much the Fordson Major in a nutshell. Hugely popular. Now, doing my research online, it was very hard to get a number on how many were built. There's so much conflicting information. It was really, really hard to get an accurate number, but I do believe it's someplace in around 500,000, over 500,000, and they were exported worldwide. They're hugely famous, popular around the world, in Australia, in America, in New Zealand, Africa. Again, they were popular all over the world. The Model N, I think, had near 250,000. Because it was hugely popular during the war. It was one of the only tractors that were still in production, certainly in the UK anyway, during wartime. And it was, they were mass produced to keep things moving. But the Fordson, a very distinctive tractor, were very well known for a bulletproof engine, a very, very reliable diesel engine. And some of the stuff that you see lads doing with them now, putting V8 engines in them, and even just taking the 4-cylinder engine and putting the turbo on it, and there's some wacky looking Fordson Majors out there. I'll tell you what lads have done to some of them. But yeah, very iconic, and very for the time they were a very modern looking tractor from the 1940s and 50s onwards, and then the later ones, the new performance Super Major. Was a very smart looking tractor with the white wheels. It made it stand out. It had a good presence about it. And the high Major, the first of them, the first of the Majors, the high Major was called the high Major because of the seating position. So the new Major, when it was introduced in the 50s, it had a lower seating position. So when you were sitting in it, you were down lower. So if you had an earlier Major, you had a high Major because you were sitting higher in the tractor. You were up a little bit more proud. But there's still loads of them out there. There's loads of them in Ireland. Dexters as well, loads of Dexters. Still very popular, and it's fantastic that there's loads of people out there that you can still get parts for them very, very easily. Very easy to source parts for them. But they are very reliable, very simple, easy to work on, low maintenance, and they're still good for doing a job around the farm, small holdings. Some of them coming now with modified, aftermarket power steering kits fitted on them. Easy enough to get them for the Major, but for the Dexter, not so easy. There is one company in Turkey. I know I had a couple of people, actually 2 people asked me about the Dexter power steer and getting a kit for the Dexter. Now I know there is one company in Turkey that does supply a kit. It's 500 or 600 euro. Then you have to get it shipped over, and they only do a production run every couple of months. So they make a few and then they sell them, and that's it. They just kind of make them to order. So there is a couple of people I need to get back to. I have been researching that information, and I've been doing a lot of research and try and get the right information that people are looking for. Because when you do go researching online, especially for these older machines, the amount of time it takes to get the right information. I try to look at 3 different sources before I start doing a video. I try to look up at least 3 different sources of information for dates and spec levels and stuff like that, because you could look at 3 and the 3 of them could all be different, and you have to try and get the one that you think is the most accurate. The heritage clubs or the collectors clubs to the Fordson Club, or the any of those specific clubs that are specific to those machines will generally be perfect. Whereas you could go onto Wikipedia or some stuff and it's just where anybody can write anything. You just don't know what you're reading. So to get the right information, to get the right dates, to get the right figures, I mightn't always have it right, but I do my best, and it does take an awful lot of time to try and weed out the little bits and pieces. So that's it for the Major. I've never driven one. I think I've sat on a couple of them when I was a child, or a neighbouring farmer to ours had one. I don't know whether he still has it or not. They had one. I do remember being on it. I never drove one. But I would like to someday. I'd like to actually buy one, because to buy one, they're really good value when you compare it to some of the other machines within that class and that year. What you can pay for a comparative tractor, they're great value for money. 3 or 4 grand will get you a really, really good one. 6 grand will get you, 6 or 7 grand will get you a good, very good reconditioned one or refurbished one. So they're not expensive compared to what you might pay for a 100 series Ferguson, or even a 35 or something. They're great value. And the Dexter then again, it ran from 58 to 64. It died out as well with the end of the Major, and it had a good little run. And there was a lot of them around as well. So that's it for tonight. I hope everybody enjoyed this. It's just a quick rundown. It's nothing too in depth. Just get an idea that where it came from the Model N to the E27 end. There was that bridge in between to the new Major, to the Power Major, to the Super Major, and to the new Performance Super Major, which was the last of them. And then you had the Dexter and the Super Dexter in between. So again, if you have one, if you drove one when you were young, because when you look at it now, production ended in 1964, so that's 60 years ago. Am I right in saying that? Yeah, 60 years ago. So, there's not too many people that will remember them new, unless you're, I suppose in your teens or 20s. So I'm sure there's people watching this that might remember one coming onto the farm when it was new, and grew up learning to drive on one. So I know they're all over the world, and they still are, and still in great use. So if you have one, if you had one, if you've got a collection of them, if there's anything if you'd like to add to the story about them, there's always loads of great comments through these videos, and I know people read down through the comments, and they appreciate the other people appreciate the comments that everybody leaves. So yeah, that's it. If you like the video, please like the video, give it a thumbs up. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost anything to subscribe as well, but it does greatly help the channel within the YouTube algorithm to get it spread out there for as many people as possible to see it. So that's it until the weekend. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all on Sunday.